Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, this play is unbelievable. It's really incredible. He packs in, and
You are paid to say that, right?
I am paid to say that a little bit, but I do also love the play. It's incredibly hard to pack in such dense information in an entertaining, fun, dramatic way. So let's go back to when you decided to tell the story of debt explosion in the mid '80s, and what drew you to that.
I don't know. I've been watching. You know, my dad made a deal with me when I first moved to New York in my mid-20s. He said, if you read the Wall Street Journal, I'll pay your rent. So I had to read the Wall Street Journal every day. And
well,
so for 2 years.
Why is that? Why the Wall
Street
Journal?
He wanted me to, you know, I had studied literature and religion in college, and I got to New York, and he and my mom, it was like, you know, my dad was like, what is this kid? Is he reading poetry all the time? You know, how's he going to make a living? And so they concocted this plan. And I think he knew me well enough to know that if I got reading about something, that I'd get interested in it. And I did. And it was an interesting time in New York. People, you know, Tina Brown had just taken over the New Yorker, and there were profiles of financiers alongside profiles of Mikhail Baryshnikov, and in culture circles, people were talking about money. So it was an interesting time to be thinking about money. And as an observer since my mid-20s of what's happened in America, it struck me that the rise of finance is really, in many ways, the great and most important untold story of why things have changed the way that they have. And at the root of the story of finance is debt, the idea of debt, because that's really what finance is. It's finding a way to finance something that you don't have the means now, so you find a way to finance it for the future.
Which is so smart, because usually when we see financial stories in movies, or I'm specifically thinking about movies right now, it's about one specific thing in one time, and it feels like that collapse happened because of that one thing in that moment, right? Like the housing collapse in The Big Short. We're not really tracking it from before, although there's a little bit of that in that movie. You can walk away feeling like that's kind of over. That happened because of this stupid thing, and now it's kind of over. And the same thing goes with Wall Street, even though Wall Street is kind of similar to this story as well. So you were trying to attack the root of how not just money in this country has changed, but how the culture has changed.
Yeah, and how you know, money, what happens in the economy and what happens financially actually transforms human behavior. And you know, we live in a world now where increasingly relationship is transactional. And at root, there is a financial or economic source to so much of that. You know, we think of it as social media, or we think of it as internet and technology, and I think that is, of course, part of it. But one of the things that I talk about, you know, increasingly is you know, Eisenhower warned us of the military-industrial complex in the 50s, right? And I actually think that the real nexus of power in America is no longer the military-industrial complex. It's what I would call the attention finance complex, by which I mean the connection between the forces of finance and the merchants of attention, Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And that technology married to the technologies of finance are what are actually changing. They're changing our brains. They're changing our way of being in the world.
In what way? Can you give an example of how that works? How the two are
Sure. I think that our pleasure principle is being carefully trained to be dependent on devices. Yes. Those devices, through the process of finance, have found a way to monetize the movements of the mind. Right. Consciousness itself is now making money for the distributors. Right? That only happens because of the technology of finance, in addition to the technology that creates the possibility for this. So the implications are enormous, and I think it's something that we don't really spend enough time thinking about and enough time understanding a little more deeply.
Right. Finance, the economy in general, we don't really think.
The implications of it. Yeah. You know, we talk a lot about the economy. We talk about the economy like it's some abstracted deity.
I feel like we talk about it like America talks about many things, good and bad, right?
Right.
The economy, I'll make more money or less money. We don't actually talk about the nuance or inextricable links between a sort of exploitative system and those that are taking part in it. All of us.
Yeah, well, I think that the conversation around those who have a lot and those who don't have so much is a very simplistic understanding of what's really happening. And I think that, you know, in America, it seems to me that we are all encouraged to believe that we can make it big. And making it big is the secret dream that keeps us all going. Very few of us are going to make it big. But that kind of dream, that fiction, is in a sense what legitimizes somebody like Trump politically. Because at root, he is a person who, it turns out, is not even the person he claims to be because of debt. It all goes back to this idea that you can take on a bunch of debt and you can become something or someone who you're not. The discrepancy between debt and real value is the same discrepancy between language and meaning, and the same discrepancy between appearance and reality. It's not a coincidence that we started to live differently in the mid-'80s and that we now have somebody in office who is nothing like what he appears to be, owns nothing like what he claims to own, and is, you know, basically an unreality.
Right, when so many people have said this is the most shocking thing to happen in this country, there were also a lot of other people saying, yeah, this is the inevitable conclusion of what started around the time that your play takes place.
Yeah.
So with all of these big ideas in mind, let's talk about how you actually craft a dramatic work. Because a dramatic work can contain these ideas, but it can't contain them on the surface. It still has to function as a piece of drama.
It sounds really boring what we're talking about, it's true. But no,
So how do you do that?
Well, technically, I mean, we can get into that, you can get as granular about that as you want. I think you have to give the audience pleasure. And giving the audience pleasure means constantly changing expectations. So you set up an expectation and then you have an A, B, A, and you think you're going to go back to B, but then you go to C, right? Or Mike Nichols once said the hero of a story is the character with the most jokes, right? So you have one dramaturgical principle is just to have characters vying on stage for who's going to be funnier. Like in many ways, many of the scenes are written that way. How many jokes can a character get in? So wit becomes an important part of that. And pace and speed. I think that increasingly, because of the technology, our capacity for concentrating is diminished. And so if you can move the play quickly,
which Junk does, moves real fast,
then you can stay at the pace that the audience is now at. Because I think that traditionally in the theater, I mean, I find going to the theater often very boring. And I think a lot of people find that, in part because it's happening at a slower pace. It's happening at a pace that I think we don't really function at anymore. So all of those sort of technical craft-like jokes, pace, changing expectation, that's all the craft of how you put it together. Now, from a larger story point of view, what I did was I took a deal and I put the deal on stage. Every part of the deal, accountants, lawyers, arbitrage guys, management, legal for management, investment banking, all of that. And it's a very simple structure in a way. It's like it begins at the beginning of the deal and it ends toward the end of the deal, and then you have the aftermath of the deal. So the audience, even though they don't know that that's the structure, they feel, oh, I get it. This thing started, this guy wants that. Oh, he's being stopped by this other guy who's lying to him about this, and oh, how are they going to figure that out? Great. That's how they're going to get, oh, they didn't get it. Oh, no, maybe now they will get it. It's just it's a simple structure. So those, on top of that, is the complex financial machination, right? But underneath it is all very simple stuff.
For instance, junk bonds, right? Which are essentially is debt in many ways, right? But at the same time, I finished watching the play and I didn't even still know exactly what a junk bond was, but I didn't give a shit. I was kind of like,
I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to explain it.
Did you ever have a scene where you explained it?
Yeah, I did. I had a monologue and it was mind-numbing, And it's like at a certain point I realized it doesn't matter. The play is just about a lot of junk. It doesn't matter that it's about junk bonds. Everything on stage is junk. And let's leave it at that. Let's not have people walking away thinking, oh, I guess junk bonds are high-yield debt which you pay on a quarter. It's like, it doesn't matter. That's not the premise of the surmise of the story. Though I know some people have complained. They're like, I thought at least I would get a definition of junk bonds, and I didn't even get that. So
well, I think that's ridiculous. What do you care? That's ridiculous.
Well, yeah.
What went into building the set for the play? The set is beautiful, and the whole idea behind it is really incredible. For those who haven't seen it, I mean, I don't want to know if I should give it away,
No,
but
yeah, please.
it's basically a stage, and in the front of the stage, it's kind of empty, but behind it is a series of almost like Hollywood squares. In each of them ends up having different scenes play out in it, and pieces of the set sort of come out in each of those squares and then roll back. And it's a really fascinating
elegant,
idea. Yeah.
The play is a riff on a Shakespearean history, right? And I don't like to talk about that too much because audiences think Shakespeare is boring, and other people think that if you compare yourself to Shakespeare, you're saying you're really good. So anyway, it's inspired.
Just using,
Yes, it's
classic
inspired.
dramatic,
That's right.
yeah.
I'm inspired by Shakespearean technique and Shakespearean history. And what John Lee Beatty did with that set was he basically built an Elizabethan stage that meets the Seagram's building. So it's a modernist version or a glass and steel version of an Elizabethan stage, which you have an above. You have entrances from both sides. You have audience, the actors can dump below, and basically the play, as you saw, takes place on that open stage. And the principal design element is the language, that the actors are in conversation with each other throughout the entire play. There's no behavior, it's just talk. And that was also consciously Shakespearean in that way.
How much of that are you a part of as the writer of the play?
None. I mean, I'm not part of the design process at all. I mean, I watched, with admiration and delight as they put it all together, but I was not involved.
How much blocking and set description do you put in your scripts? Some playwrights more so than others,
I didn't want there to be a lot of set description or any. It's a scene, and if there's an important action in the scene, then that will be listed, and then next scene, and then next scene, and next scene. I mean, there's 68 scene changes in the play. And so it's got to move fast, and it comes in, the actual stage time is 2 hours and 5 minutes. So it's very, very, very fast. And
what was the hardest part of the script for you to write? I mean, when you got down to it and you were sort of working it, what was the hardest thing to really sort of hit your vision?
I think the combination of making sure that the play felt like it was addressing now, even though it's set in the 1980s. That, and completing every single character's arc.
Which you do incredibly well. One of my favorite moments of the play is the arc of both the DA and the character who's trying to buy this steel plant. I love that the way that it drapes down. I'm trying not to give anything away for people who haven't seen it, but I
well,
just
what
love
happens is that
arc.
you have all of these. The play's about the system, right? It's not about any individual, because I think we have this illusion. We go to a movie and we see, oh, that guy, and oh, our point of view. We can understand the whole system from some person's point of view and what he wants and the moral.
It's a good and bad, evil and
it's
good.
nonsense. It's not how the world works. And so storytelling, in a way, is doing all of us a great disservice by promulgating the idea that we individually can somehow understand the whole system. So the play is an attempt to stage the system. And you have law enforcement, you have the Fourth Estate in journalism, you have finance, you have legal, you have all of these systems that are interlocked. And at the end of the play, as you were talking about, law enforcement and government sort of gets married to finance in that moment, which hopefully is a surprise, but is probably also inevitable.
It is inevitable. I mean, it wasn't something that I wasn't expecting the play to go there, but then once it goes there, it is that feeling of like, of course, like you had to do this as this play had to do this. And is that what you're talking about when you're talking about finding a way to marry this story to our current time, as finding ways to sort of inject those into the conclusion?
Yeah. How did that happen? How did politics and government become so completely beholden to the forces of finance? Sure, money's always been a part of politics, yes. But how is it now that that representatives in government actually do not even make the decisions? The people making the decisions are those who are giving them the money, right? And so telling that story is part of telling the story of the rise of finance in America. In the second act, there's a scene where the beleaguered owner of a manufacturing business who's having his company taken over, which in a way is a metaphor for the death of manufacturing in America. GM doesn't make cars anymore to make cars. They make cars to sell loans, because the cars make them 2%, but the loans on those cars make 5%. So everything becomes an excuse to manufacture, to create debt, because the debt makes you more money. But there's a scene in the second act where this CEO whose manufacturing company is being taken over turns to his investment banking advisor, says, "Is this the future? Is this what it's going to be like, getting squeezed from every side for every last penny?" And I knew that when he did that scene, everyone in the audience was not going to just be thinking about business, but their own lives.
I was thinking about the tax bill when he said that, when I was watching that scene.
Or you might be thinking about your student debt and the fees and every point of contact you have with the system, which somehow bleeds you for yet another payment. There is this kind of taxation without representation on the American social body by the corporate system. We have no way of affecting that. And that's, I think, the real reason for the rise of rage in America, is that I think everybody feels that they are being bled dry.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I couldn't agree more. How long was the process for you in writing the play?
I started writing it just about 4 years ago. And then it took me a year to do the research and write the first draft. And then it's been a process of, developing it with Doug in workshop. And we did a production in at La Jolla Playhouse on the West Coast last year, which was very well received, which is why we ended up here on Broadway.
Did you change it all, moving it to Broadway?
Yeah, I mean, I just tightened and sharpened. Somebody who had seen it there came and saw it on Broadway and said, "Wow, it's exactly the same play, but it's totally different."
Right.
So I think that's a good rewrite, is that you've tweaked and you've sharpened and you've honed and you've made it what it was more.
Yeah. One of the things about the play is the main character who we're talking about, who ends up sort of being the guy who's leading this deal and then goes
who's found new ways to raise money by selling debt.
And one of the things that we were just talking about was you can't really look at the economy as good or bad, and the way that money flows in this country is good or bad. And you end up presenting a very sympathetic depiction of a man who is bleeding people dry in many ways and is sort of restructuring the economy in new ways. But we see this part of him where he does actually think he's doing it for the good of a lot of people, even while at the same time thinking that he might own as much as he could possibly own. There are moments where he thinks he's doing it for the good of the working people of the country.
I think American capitalism is driven by an ideology of a moral good. I think it's a fiction. I don't think it's true, but I think we believe that there is a moral good inherent in American capitalism, that if you're smarter and better individually, irrespective of your race or your color or your creed or your religion or whatever, that you can get ahead. And getting ahead in America means wealth. There's no other way to get ahead, really, in America.
It's interesting because other countries in Europe, you get ahead by continuing to educate yourself.
Yeah, come on. Not here.
Yeah.
Get rich or die trying.
Yeah.
And because it's the essence of I think post mid-'80s, that's the essence of the American value system. But I think what's always uncomfortable, or what doesn't sit well with anybody, I think everybody intuitively understands that something about money is not moral or immoral, it's amoral. It has no morality, it's just a thing. And it turns out that capitalism has its own rule system, and that rule system is not immoral and it's not moral, it's amoral. And our humanist aspirations, which we like to think of as moral, sit very uncomfortably against this system of capitalism. And so that contradiction is something we're constantly struggling with. And what I wanted to do was to put the audience in the situation of struggling with that contradiction by seeing the embodiment of capitalism, who is amoral, immoral, and moral all at the same time.
Which he is.
Right, because that's the truth.
Yeah. So where do you fall after having read the Wall Street Journal since your mid-20s, when they buy you a subscription, to writing this play? Where do you fall on capitalism and where we currently stand with the system? Because we are reaching this point. There was just a study a couple weeks ago that was the millennials on majority don't believe that capitalism is a system that works.
Right, and yet millennial lifestyle is entirely informed. The infrastructure of it doesn't exist without mature capitalism. Right, there's no way. I think the dilemma we all find ourselves in is it's easy to criticize capitalism, and it's even easier to enjoy its benefits.
Yes. But it's nearly impossible to take yourself out of the system in any way.
That's right.
That would be the only thing that in some regards could take down the system itself.
And I think that the real issue
None of us are going to live off the grid.
No, we aren't. And I think the real issue is one that goes deeper, which is that I think ultimately as Americans, we think that our own well-being is the most important thing in our lives. There is no meaningful definition of we as a collective. And so that married to capitalism and wealth accumulation is what is actually destroying the country and really the world in many ways. And until we can find a way to get back to a we, we're going to have a tough time. I think that the climate is going to force us to understand how to be a we, but it may have to get a lot worse before we can really understand that.
How do we get ourselves back to being a we? Thinking of ourselves as a we?
I think that's a subject for another time. It's a very big conversation.
You don't have all the answers. Come on.
Well, no, I don't, but I also don't, I think it's complicated.
Yeah.
I think it's very complicated when you have an educational system that has been systematically gutted over 40 years, when you have ideology about unfettered individualism on both the left and the right, the freedom to use whatever bathroom I want to use, the freedom to make as much money as I want to make. It doesn't matter. It's all taken from the same well. So those values are so deeply impregnated in the American psyche, both on the conservative and the liberal side. I don't know how you really get past that until you have, some people say that Trump et al. Are really a wrecking ball that can help to reshape and reshift. I'm not so sure I'm that optimistic. Yeah. I do think
if we get out of it alive, it might be.
Yeah, right.
We might be able to reshape it if we're still walking in 5 years.
Well, if we still have clean drinking water in vast swaths of this country. I mean, just to be very concrete, the way that the government is being dismantled, again, under the ideology of individual flourishing. It's always about the individual. So until we understand innately as animals, I don't mean as intellects, as animals, that we is more important than I, that our flourishing has to come before my well-being, I don't know that there's and was it ever thus? Well, I think, a few generations ago, there was a meaningful definition of we in America. Unfortunately, that we meant that there were some groups who were not part of the we in the way that the we was. They were we, but we bad, or we marginalized, or we oppressed. It's all still one thing, but it was a system which needed to change, has changed, and is changing, but unfortunately the tool of that change has been individualism.
It still blows me away, and this is a kiss-assy compliment, it still blows me away that you can tie up all these ideas in your head and still create a very fast-paced, entertaining, dramatic structure.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way.
Let's get some questions from the audience. Who has a question? Right here.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm extremely fascinated how well-informed and educated you are about all the world issues. Yet you chose plays and screenwriting.
My mom says the same thing. Why are you writing plays?
You want to be a pundit?
But do you feel like you really contribute to the world by making people think about this? And also another question I'm dying to ask you. You had a writer's block for 10 years. Is that because you were just too informed about everything and you didn't know what to pinpoint? Or what was the cause of that?
No, so you're very informed. I'm confused how you know these things. But anyway, you don't choose your passions. You don't choose who you fall in love with, right? And you may find somebody and think, oh, I should be in love with that person, but you're not. Or you may find somebody and say, oh, wow, I really shouldn't be in love with that person, and you are, right? And so the theater is a passion and a love in my life, and I do write for the movies and TV. I've done so less successfully than for theater. It's just something that I love, and I would love that work somehow occasions conversations like this, which it is, in part. Writer's block, I had a teacher in college. I wrote my first short story, and I was in a fiction writing class, and my teacher read the story and called me into his office and said, I think it's the best short story I've read by a student, and I think you should send it to the New Yorker and the Atlantic. Here are their addresses. I know the editors. I think you've got a good shot at getting published. I walked out of his office on cloud 9, and I couldn't write after that. It was being seen in a way that I wasn't ready for. And I was worried that I wouldn't know where that had come from, and I didn't know how I would do it again. And so that's actually when I started to become informed, because I couldn't write. So I started spending a lot of time reading. And I mean, that's a simplification, but there's some truth to it. So,
when did theater become the sort of the medium that you wanted to express yourself in?
I mean, you know, in college, but I will say the first time I fell in love, I was in 4th grade, and I had gone to the class next door, and they were putting on a play about Susan B. Anthony, and one of the girls in the jury box stood up and spoke a line, and I saw her, and I just was like, for the next 5 years, I was obsessed with this girl, right? So that very first experience of love, or eros, happened for me in a play. You know, and I used to dream, have these recurring dreams about theaters as a child. My parents never took me to a theater. My parents are both doctors. So there's some mysterious connection with the theater that I can't account for. I started really doing it in college. And then, you know, through my 20s and 30s, though I worked in the film business more, I made a living there and taught acting and that sort of stuff. And then I started writing plays in my mid-30s, and you know, here we are.
I have to ask, so they got you the Wall Street Journal, you know, a long time ago, as you said at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
Do you still read the Wall Street Journal, and what is it like now? Because I never really read it, but what is it like now versus the time when you first started reading
when
it?
I was reading the Wall Street Journal in the 90s, it was the best written paper probably in America. And there was always a story on the front page, on the column on the side, that was the best feature story about, you know, an entrepreneur getting a business up that was really a story about a community, or any number of sort of personal features. It was the best story in news, well known. And then, of course, you know, Mr. Murdoch took over the Wall Street Journal, and it has, you know, the writing has gotten worse. The editorial page with the advent of Trump is a joke, and I do still read it because the information it is helpful, but you know, I think that they've lost a lot of credibility amongst folks who are not members of the tribe, but who still work in the business. Because there's a lot of people who are more thoughtful who do work in finance. And the smartest guy I know runs a hedge fund. He just canceled his subscription to the Journal because he can't take it anymore. You know,
become a kind of mouthpiece for the economic ideologies of the
and for the Trump administration, support of the Trump administration, which is, you know, patently absurd.
Patently absurd. Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's not, I don't even know why we're talking about it. I guess because we have to, right? But it's so silly that you just you can't fathom the stupidity of it.
So every day is like a fresh hell where you have to go, yeah, he did that. Yeah, I know.
Right.
I know.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hey, Ayad. So I saw your play Disgraced on Broadway, and I know you've done some other stories centering around the Muslim experience. Was there a conscious effort, or maybe not to go into that now, or was it just you know, those stories that you needed to tell at the time?
Right. You know, it's interesting. I spent a bunch of years writing about my experience growing up, and then my experience, you know, being in this culture as an insider-outsider, right? And those stories were pegged as stories about Muslims, which Disgraced is a story about a guy who's saying, I'm not Muslim, right? So there's, of course, truth to it, but there's, of course, not truth to it in another way. And my mom used to say to me, you know, Ayad, you got to stop it with this Muslim thing. You know, I mean, you keep everybody. And I said, Mom, I don't choose my subjects. They choose me. I just follow what my passion is and what I'm interested in. So that's what I'm doing. And I have no doubt I will return to all of that subject matter, because the stories of the people in my life are continuing and unfolding, and there are interesting things about America to say about America and about living and being alive now in their lives. So I'll come back to it, and I'll probably get off of it again and come back to it and get off of it. It's a tricky thing when you get known for something, and then you do something that people think is different. It's not really that different. This play's about an anti-hero who is an insider-outsider, who is at war with his own tribe, who, you know, it's all of the same themes, but...
He's also dealing with his own, his own Jewishness as well.
Right, well, in a similar way, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Next question, right here.
Hi, so since you discussed about writing this play for 4 years and reading the Wall Street Journal on a regular, what was the definite motivation for you? Was there any, like, point where you had the beside the writer's block, and then that certain motivation that made you go, no, I need to tell this story today. I need to tell it now. What was that motivation?
Yeah, I think that the country is in bad shape. I think we're in worse shape than we understand. I think we've got some serious problems, and I think people don't understand the problems that we have. And I don't say that with any contempt. I say that with compassion, and I say that understanding how hard it has been for me to try to understand those problems. And so it felt to me and to my partner in this process, Doug Hughes, the director, that if we could put together something that was going to be of service to our fellow citizens in a way, if you will, that would probably be the best thing we could do right now. So that was really what drove me, was to try to tell this story, because I think inside this story is the story of what has happened to America.
Can I also get you to differentiate between us being in bad shape right now and what has happened to America versus Trump? Because I think so often we're in this place where when people try to have conversations about where America is right now, why we're in a bad place, it often gets diluted into this idea. It's like, well, it's just Trump. He's disgusting. It's like, that is true, but he's actually a very small part in many ways of why we're in a bad place.
Yeah,
right now.
and I think he's the symptom. He's been implied for generations now. I mean, I think that, you know, there are so many different ways of looking at how America has continued to be sold out from under us, and how over time we are become no longer a republic of citizens, but a republic of customers. That is to say, it used to be that as a member of society, you know, Rousseau talks about giving up your innate freedom and becoming part of society, and what society gives you as a trade-off is protection, education, health, right? All of those things. Well, those things are yours to have now, but not as a citizen, as a customer. You can buy those things. They are not promised to you. And this ideology of somehow, you know, young generations that are being released into the world, into the marketplace, with a kind of indentured servitude to debt. We're living in a feudal order in which the lords are those with capital and the serfs are the rest of us. But we think we're free, and we think we can participate in the political process, but we can't.
They're also removing our participation in the political process at a certain point as well.
But even our participation in the political process is just a vote. The only meaningful agency in the political process now is having money. It's like the feudal order before, where if you were landed gentry, if you owned land, you had a vote, right? Now, if you have money, you have say. That's what's happened. And I think that there are lots of illusions about what America is and what it's not, and how great it is, that keep us believing. But in fact, things have changed, and I think everybody knows it.
Well, when people talk about why America is so great and where that illusion comes from, it usually is in reference to individualism and liberty and being able to do all these things that people, for some reason, think you can't do in other do in other countries. Which
I have a friend from France who came to America for the first time and said, "Oh, this freedom everyone's always talking. It's just freedom to make money."
Yeah.
That's all. I'd say the only difference between being in France and being here is when you make a lot of money in France, people, they don't like it. When you make a lot of money here, well, it's your free to make money. Nobody's going to give you a rough time about it.
Right.
That's the freedom. That's American freedom. And again, we know that. We all know that. And we're all dreaming about hitting it big. That's the Kool-Aid that we're drinking, and that's keeping us in this cycle.
Well, and I love
very depressing conversation.
Well, you know what?
But I had fun.
No, name one thing you love about. No, don't do that. I love the play so much.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for having me.
It's big, it's beautiful, it's funny, and it moves like a freight train, man. Congratulations. Give him a round of applause. It's at Lincoln Center right now. Get tickets. Go see it. Ayad Akhtar.